All right, welcome everybody. This is our first session in April, and if you guys have been following us, we had this RL mini series in March where we had talks around organized around RL, and in April we have three talks scheduled for this month, and they're all about world modeling. And for the first talk, I'm very excited to host Reece Keller from CMU, who's going to tell us about zebrafish world modeling.
Yeah,
Welcome,
thanks.
Reece.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hadi. I'm gonna try to share my screen here.
Actually, before you start with the presentation, do you mind if you talk a little bit about, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself to the group and tell us a little bit about your background, your current research interests, and maybe like how did this paper come to be?
Sure. Yeah, so again, my name is Reese. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon in neural computation and robotics. Um, and yeah, so I guess I'm coming at this from the perspective of a computationalist. I'm a theorist by training. Now I work more in the neuro AI side, so it's more empirical. Um, I work with someone named Aron Nayebi. He's a student of Dan Yeamans and Zach Pitko, who's a theorist at CMU. And this paper that I'm going to talk about, it really came to be because, um, it was actually just very random around, there's a new faculty at Carnegie Mellon. And he comes from this neuro AI tradition, and I was working with Zach, who's a theorist, and I was very interested in embodied AI and specifically connecting neuro AI to my real passion, which was reinforcement learning. And if any of you are familiar with sort of the neuro AI literature that's sort of started around maybe 10 years ago now, it's been mainly focused on vision. There's some sort of motor control studies from like David Suslow and things like that. Um, and the real thing that inspired me was noticing that there's really a difference between task optimization and uh well, I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I think Hadi looks a little busy here, but I'll have a little bit of this background in the talk. Maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. Um, but at a high level, I guess before without talking the details, it is a very random project. I met Misha Arens, who's an experimentalist at Genelia. Yeah, this really cool data set of completely autonomous behavior. And we wanted to sort of bridge some ideas I'm going to talk about. So
Thanks, Reese. Yeah, I guess I just want to highlight one thing that I just mentioned to you before we started recording. I mean,
sure.
this is a cool modeling paper, but one thing that is worth highlighting is the philosophy you're taking to neuro AI. If you look at the literature right now, most, maybe like a majority of papers are just like taking some data and fitting some model to that data and then using these data-driven models to analyze neural data. And
Hmm.
nothing wrong with that. I think that's very valuable. But what you're doing here is, I think it's also very valuable, and we should do more of that, which is don't really use data to train a model and think about a normative principle or something and come up with some objective function, train a model that behaves, and then validate it against neural data. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that I really like this work. And, let's get right into it.
Yeah. Can you guys see my screen? Is it
Yeah.
working?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm having trouble. Let me see if I can see your guys' videos would be nice. Um
Oh, I had this issue recently as well. Maybe it's just
um
a new Zoom update or something.
yeah, it's always a little weird not seeing okay, maybe that's okay. I'm not quite sure how to fix this. Okay, so oops. How do I go back here?
Also, your slides, we're seeing the presenter notes as
Oh,
well.
that's why.
Yeah.
Um, there we go.
Yeah, fixed.
Okay, is that working okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, thanks for that intro, Hadi. It's funny that that you're talking about that's completely self-supervised, which is I think is something that actually when I presented it in the past or even talked to people about it, it was kind of lost on folks that there was no neural data used here for the
Mhm.
training. So it's I'm glad that you picked that up. I'll talk about that in a bit. So I'm really interested in what I would call autonomy. So autonomy is something kind of a cognitive sciencey word that we kind of throw around, but you kind of think of it as agency. So to me, there's this spectrum in all sort of agents, whether it's biological, any sort of natural agent, between sort of intrinsic and intrinsic drives. So of course, if we look on the right-hand side of here, extrinsic drives can be really anything that's intrinsic, but it's the important part is externally conditioned. So, like for example, if you're having like a food reward, of course we have primary reward circuits in the brain, of course, for hunger, sleep, things like that. But as soon as you take those primary rewards and then start having some extrinsic stimulus that conditions you from the environment that tells you whether to do behavior based on, that primary circuit, that's what we call an extrinsic drive. So there's a little bit of it's mostly philosophical. I mean, all of these things are intrinsic drives in some way, but the interesting intrinsic drives are the ones that go beyond the physiological ones. So humans and animals have developed these more cognitive intrinsic drives that produce really interesting behaviors that are more akin to things like exploration, curiosity, play, things like that. And those, although, those probably evolved because they have sort of some extrinsic uses, um, we're kind of at the point where we're maybe at a minimum in that evolution, that optimization landscape. So rather than trying to understand how curiosity came into being, it's more interesting for me to understand how these really interesting intrinsic drives can be formalized to begin with. So we can have more of a normative approach to understand what these intrinsic drives look like. And so autonomy, with that said, is the capacity for an agent to motivate behavior not only by external states, but by internal states as well. So this is opposed to like if you're completely, pre-programmed or like an automaton, you'd just be an input-output function, right? You have some extrinsic stimulus that's mapped onto some output. Here we have internal states, right, that can drive behavior as well. And autonomy is not the fact that you have internal states, it's that combined with being able to dynamically switch between them. So if we think about any animal really, and we think about their natural behavior, whether it's ethological or not, even if like if you think about even a home cage environment of like training a mouse where it can choose when to do its trials, the animal does a lot more things than just, the extrinsic drive of getting its water reward at the nose port and doing a trial. It explores. Once you put new things in the cage, it likes to poke around, see what's going on there. It might do mating behaviors. There's lots of other intrinsically motivated behaviors that have nothing to do with, the task that it's supposed to be solving. And so I think all behavior should be seen as really a dynamic composition of these drives in time, right? So you take an agent, you have a bunch of these intrinsic and extrinsic drives that could appeal to you at any given time. And then you have some sort of configurator that's actually drawing these arrows and saying at any point in time, what is motivating my behavior? And if you look at especially more intelligent behaviors like in primates and humans, there's a lot more of this like sort of curiosity and play sociality that will happen as natural behavior evolves. That is much more than just being able to solve a specific kind of task. And so to take a step back, why is this sort of task optimization view so prevalent, where it's like, okay, like write down an objective function, optimize a system to achieve some score metric on that objective function and go on. And I think it really goes back to our kind of human biases in the ways that we prescribe intelligence in other systems. So if we think about the earliest quests of artificial intelligence, which was to maybe build build machines that can think, it dated back to what we call the Turing test, what we call that now, which is really about, I mean, there's lots of nuances to how to interpret the Turing test, but it's really about if a human judge can classify a response from, in this case, it was a language response, so symbols, a written response, as human or not. And that's what we would call the Turing test. And there is really about symbols, but it can language symbols, but it obviously can be generalized to things like, code, which of course is in natural, not natural, but in language as well, or math for automated theorem improvers and such and such. And there, what we're classifying again is behavior, it's the output of the system, right? And I think we could all agree, although there's some empirical studies too that formalizes a bit better that language models today and coding agents and the the sort of math tools we have today have probably passed this Turing test, right? I think we have pretty good language model, pretty good chatbots, where you really, I mean, again, there's studies that show this, but really humans can't distinguish from that as well. But in the 50s, robotics wasn't really a big thing yet, and so it really made sense to think about things this way. Again, behavior here was written language. Um, but there's this kind of extension to this history of extensions that first started with Stephen Harnad that tried to extend the Turing test to the idea of a robot. So if you had a robot, robots at least then it wasn't the natural modality here. It's like robots in the real world. So your behavioral output space is continuous, right? It's the physics of the real world. It's not language. And so the equivalent Turing test here is an embodied one. So can a robot behave in ways that are indistinguishable from whatever that robot's supposed to be doing or supposed to be mimicking? And so here it's sensory motor intelligence rather than, language intelligence. And there's lots of really cool examples of getting this to work. So like, for example, this top video is from Boston Dynamics. So this is called out. This is an Atlas, actually. This is some other robot. But if we look at this, robotics has come really a long way. So this is going to show this robot doing a bunch of different behaviors like walking and running. I think this one's going to do some type. Okay, this is crawling. And what's impressive is one, not only that it does this, like I mean, this is pretty cool that you can get this movement. What's more impressive is how naturalistic it is, right? So if you look at these behaviors, like it just did sort of a John Wick style kind of roll there, they're really human-like, right? And that's really impressive. So despite like the robot looking like this, I mean, if it had some sort of human skin on it, a lot of these behaviors, it really is kind of indistinguishable in a lot of ways. Um, and that's quite impressive. There's other examples, of course. You guys are in California, so I was giving a talk at Stanford a few months ago. It was my first time driving in a Waymo, and I, for one, was really impressed with how good this was. Like, this is definitely easier, like pretty as good in 90% of cases as a human driver. Of course, there's some problems with Waymo. It can't go on certain routes, or there's some adversarial attacks you can do. It's pretty damn good as far as a autonomous vehicle goes. And then this last video here, this is from Figure Robotics. This is a humanoid doing a task of folding laundry, and it's a bit slow, maybe a little bit. Yeah, I guess the main thing is just slow doing this, but otherwise it's folding laundry in the way a human would. And these are all examples of maybe in these sort of slivers of ways, individual behaviors, you being able to sort of pass maybe some t type of embodied Turing test, some matching the sensory motor capabilities of a human or an animal. Um, but it can actually go beyond that because in NeuroAI, as it originally evolved, was again, like I said before, it's mostly focused on vision, right? And so, with the goal, the neuro part of the NeuroAI was about trying to predict brain data, right? Trying to build predictive models of, in this case, the visual pathway, different brain regions in the vi visual pathway. And so now that we're coming to embodiment, it doesn't have to be embodied. There's this, it kind of begs the question or begs the notion of a neuro-AI version of Turing test. So this was just recently proposed by Aran Naebi and his colleagues. That is very simple, and it just says basically, in addition to trying to match behavior, it shouldn't be the only thing. If it's going to be a model of the brain, not only should it be a predictive model of the behavior, but it should also be a predictive model to the extent that there are mechanisms in the model that are sufficient and necessary mechanisms that map onto the brain. They're sufficient and necessary to predict brain data. And so not only do you want to match behavior, you also want to match the internal representation. So there has to be a representational convergence, whereas sort of the embodied Turing test doesn't specify how you get to matching the behavior, right? You can do it however you want, as long as, an outside observer can't tell that the Waymo isn't driven by a human or that the robot isn't doing a backflip is indeed a robot. We don't care actually the algorithms. But in these three examples, they're actually very different in the way they achieve this. Like Boston Dynamics is really famous for using sort of the good old-fashioned engineering techniques of just control theory and optimal control to achieve these kinds of policies. Whereas Figure and other, kind of robotics these days, they like to use learning-based methods. So Figure is actually an extreme example because it's almost, I think, completely end-to-end a learning-based robot. And Waymo, I mean, I'm not an expert on autonomous vehicles, but I think it's actually a mix of symbolic and learning-based methods. But the point is, we don't actually care how you implement it, right? The point is that you do the task, like that you solve the task in a way that's indistinguishable from the real system. But of course, if it's going to be a model of the brain, not only does it have to walk the walk, it actually has to predict brain data, which in the evidence from a decade of neuro AI research shows that what you need to do that is actually mechanisms that are similar to the mechanisms real brain has. So this is a neuro AI Turing test. It also has to have this sort of representational convergence. And so here I have some examples from some recent work where the advent of physics simulation has made this a lot more tractable. So here I'm showing a virtual fruit fly, but there's also a virtual rodent, and people even do this with humans as well, where you build a skeletal model. So let me play this video here with this. So they're actually imaging, all the depths of this fly. In this case, this is a fruit fly. It's called the Drosophila melanogaster. And they convert this to a 3D mesh, which then they put into a physics simulator where each joint can be actuated in some type of way. So in this case, it's torque actuated. There's actual musculoskeletal models as well, where you can model different types of muscle types, etc. And the goal here is the point of doing this is actually just sort of a closed loop sandbox for neuroscience. If you can sort of produce the behavior, but then also in the case of the fly, we have full connectomics at this point of the central nervous system and the ventral nerve cord, and so we can actually embody this connectome inside the fly and ask all kinds of other questions too about, there's many different things you can do, but the point is, can you get a fly to sort of fly like a fly while doing it in a way that respects the structure of the fly so that you can predict certain cell types, different dynamics in that way. And that may or may not require the structure that's in a connectome. That's a different question. Um, okay, so but how do all of these things are successful? Why? Because again, like we like to prescribe intelligence when there's a task that we can write down, right? With vision models, it was the most simplest example is image categorization or image recognition, right? It's a very ethological task that you can just write down, and it's easy to write down a loss function for that. And so we can just prescribe intelligence or the efficacy of a system just in our ability to identify that goal, right? And these other examples here of these other robots, these are all really specific tasks, right? Where you can there's lots of constraints. You can write down what you actually have to do in a specific setting, like walking, or folding a laundry or navigating a route. But I think actually, while humans are really good at carrying out tasks, there's lots of behaviors, really actually an underlying behavior that comes before we to solve tasks that has nothing to do with goals, I think. So maybe this is a really famous video, maybe some of you have seen this, but this is just a time lapse of a baby playing around in this room. And now the question is, okay, we have like robots that can do backflips or cars that can drive all over San Francisco. How do we get a robot to do this, right? And the reason why this is weird is because there's not really a clear motivation for this behavior. Like obviously we as humans know, like, oh, it's probably playing, right? Or is it exploring? The point is, it's really hard to computationally formalize play, or exploration in this way. Like you could maybe say, the baby needs to touch everything in the room with uniform probability, but that's not actually like that's kind of as far as you can go off the top of your head, but those aren't actually scalable methods, right? If you look at what they're doing, that wouldn't reproduce this behavior, let alone if we tried to predict data from it. So the question is, how do we get this, right? Because this is a really interesting behavior, and I think it's actually what underlies what we mean in neuroscience when we say we're after adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior isn't just about, the ability to do specific tasks and switching between them. It's underlined by the ability to do anything you want, right? And then switch on and off whatever you're tuned to or attending to, and that is the capacity for autonomy. And so that comes before any sort of task specification. It's just a mechanism that humans to animals come born with. And so if we want to model agents, computationally, usually we use or the most successful framework to do this is the reinforcement learning framework. But of course, in classical reinforcement learning, the reward is the specification of the task, right? When you write down an MDP, the reward function is it's supposed to align with the optimal behavior you want, and it comes from the environment, right? Like policy just executes an action, and that's the reward. It gets a really special spot for observing it. Usually, it's not part of the observation, right? It just goes straight into its learning signal, and it comes extrinsically. But of course, this baby, right? There's no one supervising the baby, telling it like how to play, right? Or like what things to touch or put in its mouth. And so if we remove the stream, of course, the alternative is that, okay, we have some intrinsic learning signal here where the agent generates its own desire to do these things. And so the goal here is like, what can we plug in for R, this intrinsic reward that captures autonomous behaviors like this? Reinforcement learning algorithms are really successful optimizing task rewards, and you can train policies to do all kinds of crazy stuff. But what happens when you don't have a task reward and you want to capture behavior like this without copying it, right? Without imitation learning? Like, how do you design a self-supervised reward here to capture autonomous behaviors? So this autonomous behavior I would call like exploration. There's other types, but today we're mostly going to be talking about exploration. And by the way, yeah, so this is, I think Hadi mentioned this to me, but if anyone wants to interrupt or clarify anything at any point, feel free to do so. So, Um, now, okay, I talked about autonomy in animals so far, and how do we think about that computationally? Fortunately, there's like a really an obvious and direct analog of what I'm talking about autonomy in reinforcement learning. So, reinforcement learning, there's the problem of exploration, right? This is one of the most fundamental problems, is that when you have an agent behaving in a world or in some type of environment, the question is, how do you choose good actions in the absence of a really dense learning signal? And so, of course, how difficult this problem is depends on, the nature of the environment. So, for example, in grid world, where you have a discrete state space and discrete action space, you can actually get away with really simple heuristics. These work surprisingly well. What are those heuristics? You might have heard of epsilon greedy. This is a general thing, but for policies, this just means that with some probability, you pick a random action with, you can say with uniform probability. So you pick some distribution, you pick a random action every now and then. Otherwise, you pick your action from your optimal policy or the policy that's being optimized to, in this case, move to the goal. Okay, so every now and then you just do something crazy. What happens though in more complex environments? So this is this guy on the right here. This is a humanoid in the DeepMind control suite, which is a continuous control benchmark suite. And so right here, the action space here is now continuous, right? And this is about 40 dimensions, I think, or so. But what matters actually is that it's continuous. And here, again, if you imagine that you try to take a random action, what happens in the grid rule case? I mean, there's two of these actions that would actually move you closer to the goal, right? So you have a 50% chance of actually being a good action, even though it was totally random. If that's no longer the case, even if you were in low dimensions, but your state space was continuous, right? So imagine this humanoid was like even 4 dimensions, like the grid world case. If you take a random action in continuous space, that's not going to lead to a walking policy. So it's very low probability that that action coincides with the action optimal for the walking policy, for example. And so instead, what do? You don't want to just pick random actions, but if you're optimizing, you can do something basically similar. If you have a task that you're optimizing anyways, you can just add a sort of a bonus here. It's called max entropy reinforcement learning, where you just add an entropy bonus to the reward. So it's kind of like an intrinsic reward. And you basically want your policy distribution to be as random as possible. So it's a constraint on your optimal policy, while still maximizing the reward as determined by your task reward. So JPI is your actual cost function from the MDP, and then you have this entropy bonus. And usually there's some coefficient here on this entropy. So early on in exploration, you maybe pick random actions because you're getting bonuses for your policy being max entropy. And then later, once you actually have enough information to just pursue the task reward, you wouldn't use your this entropy reward as much because it's scaled down. And so this is another heuristic, and actually works, even though it's pretty dumb, right? You're just saying solve the task, but be as random as possible while solving the task. And it's great when things are dumb and work well because they're simple, but the problem is this only works if there's still an extrinsic task, right? Obviously, if there's no optimal policy, you can't do epsilon greedy or max n, right? Because then you're just optimizing a policy to be completely random, which is makes no sense. And so the point is when there's no extrinsic task, simple heuristics for exploration don't work well, right? You can't generate meaningful behavior. And of course, reinforcement learning researchers have obviously thought about this. So the answer is to do something a little bit smarter. And so let's go to the extreme case where you actually have no reward in the environment. Of course, you can have sparse reward, whatever. Like you can imagine if you're solving a maze, when you only get your learning signal right at the end of the maze, it's very difficult to solve that without a sophisticated exploration mechanism. But we can even go further than that and say, what if you're just in an environment like that baby was, where it's completely reward free? Um, what do you do in that case? Well, the simplest thing to do is if you look at the structure of MDP, the most interesting component of that is the transition kernel, right? This is the dynamics of your environment. And so what you can do is just ask the agent to learn its own internal model of that transition kernel, right? So this omega theta here parameterizes a model of the environment physics or dynamics if it's not a physics simulator. And there's many different ways to then use that model because once you have it, right, you can look at the uncertainty in that model. You can look at its error, whatever. There's different ways. But we're going to start with building a world model. So in reinforcement learning, when we say world model, we usually really just mean a model of the environment dynamics of the transition kernel. And so this is where we start to get into what it means to define model-based intrinsic motivation. So there's many different intrinsic motivations, like the one I just mentioned, the entropy one. You could consider that an intrinsic motivation. It's not model-based, right? Because it doesn't actually use the transition structure of the environment at all to add that uh, entropy bonus. Instead, once you start using a world model to define your intrinsic reward, this is the model-based intrinsic motivation. So there's different ways of doing that, right? The simplest way is if you just, it's called curiosity. This stems from literature psychology, but actually the original proposition of this was by this guy, Deepak Pathak, actually did his PhD at Berkeley. He's a professor at CMU now. But the basic idea is if you learn this transition kernel, right, and just take its prediction error, this is the Shannon surprise of the prediction of the world model. This gives you a measure of how little you know about those transitions, right? So if your world model is really bad, your prediction was really far away from the true mean or the true prediction of S prime here, then your probability there will be small and you'd have a really high reward. So you have a high prediction error, so your reward would be high. And so it's adversarial because you would basically want to keep pursuing transitions that your learner, your world model can't predict. And by doing that, by pursuing those predictions, your world model wants to learn better and wants to predict the next state more and more accurately. So its omega theta is optimized, let's say mean squared error or something. But then your policy is trying to increase the mean squared error of your world model, right? So you have this kind of two-player game, and that gives you that's a pretty actually interesting model. But that
Reese,
has some
can I
problems.
ask
Yeah.
a clarification for the first one, curiosity?
Mhm.
This is called prediction error because actually what you optimize is the expectation of this reward, where
Yeah.
where there's some ground truth, the expectation over samples that are some sort of ground truth signals. Like when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
take that action, reality gives you what the state should have been, and
Yeah.
then okay, that's yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So as I've written it, right? Um, yeah. So in your head, for example, you can imagine this is Gaussian. And so then if you take the log probability there, and let's say you're learning the mean, then you're comparing the predicted mean with the true mean. But in
Mhm.
general, yeah, this way of writing it isn't super clear, but it really is the expectation of
Yeah.
your predictions.
Yes, but yeah, so this is just the cross entropy of the world model transition
Yep.
probability. Okay,
Yep.
cool.
Um, okay, so that has some problems though, right? If you think about it, if anybody of you've heard of the noisy TV problem, imagine you're in an environment and there's an entropy generator. So by that I just mean there's some stimulus in the environment that's has max entropy. So you can imagine like a white noise. This is a white noise distribution, for example, that's playing on a TV monitor in your environment, and you go and see that TV monitor. And then is that an interesting state or non-interesting state? If you were curious by this formulation, right? You're curious because you can't predict the next state. So you're curious when you cannot predict the next state. And of course, with if it's purely stochastic, this learner is never going to be able to reduce its surprise on the noisy TV, and you'll descend to just predicting the mean of that white noise distribution. And so you'll just perseverate on the TV, right? You'll never leave because you keep getting rewarded for the stimulus that you can't predict. So that's obviously a problem. I mean, not all
So the
environments. Sorry.
some would that mean the thing you sort of want more is information gain of your world model?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the natural choice. So I'll mention that in a second. But there's another thing that you can do that's a little simpler. That's actually related to information gain. So in the active learning literature, there's something called disagreement. So disagreement says instead of having one world model, let's say you have like n of them. Okay, let's say you have five, for example, that you have five different forward models of the in dynamics that have different parameters. So I should have indexed the thetas here by j. These are different thetas for each j. Okay, and then instead of taking the prediction error, you take all of their predictions and you just take the variance of that vector and say over time over that time step, and that's your intrinsic reward for that step. And this is just one computationally efficient way of implementing something like information gain over in like Bayesian information gain, where you're trying to choose actions that reduce uncertainty about your model parameters. And disagreement sort of like a lower bound on that. The details of that don't matter, but that's one way of implementing information gain. It's called ensemble variance. But there's also another way of doing this, which is if you just track the temporal dynamics of your prediction error, right? So if instead of asking what my prediction error is just at each point in time, you track it over time, then you can have a sense of how much your prediction error is changing, like the dynamics of that error. And if you're perseverating on like something like the noisy TV, then of course your prediction error flattens, and so the dynamics, the derivative there is zero. And so then you would not get any reward instead of getting the reward for just the prediction error. So the way this is implemented is just by keeping two world models. Well, in this case, omega theta and omega theta prime. And the difference between these two world models is they just represent different moments in time. So for theta, you could either just have like a copy of your weights from 10 optimization steps ago, or similar to the way we do discounting in RL, if you just do exponentially weighted average of your online parameters, theta prime, then you can sort of maintain a exponential memory over your online parameters. So here you're updating theta prime every step, just with, you get gradients at every step. Those are optimized online. And then theta is just a moving average of those weights. And then so depending on this gamma here, that's the time scale of this moving average will determine how much memory of the past you keep when you update your memory. And so this is kind of like information gain as well. I mean, it's not information, theoretically, it's not information gain, but it's the kind of the gain in your prediction error over time. And so these are all different ways of avoiding those kinds of problems and having more adaptive behavior, because like you don't want to perseverate on something that you can't predict. And these are both different alternatives. One's information based, kind of like info gain. The other is more dynamics based.
I want to add one paper here because so there's a professor here, Fritz Sommer, and he has a
Mhm.
paper from 2014 where they formulate something they call predictable or predictive information gain, PIG.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah,
That's probably, in my opinion, one of the most principled approaches to this that I've seen. They start from the forward KL, they quantify the amount of information that there is in the world that you ha still haven't learned, and then they turn it into Bayesian inference. And I think this is I'd be curious if you have seen that work,
yeah,
and if
yeah.
I know
I'm
you
familiar
have.
with that. So
Okay.
the reason, even with disagreement, the reason why it's not actually implemented as
Yeah.
uh, Bayesian uh, info gain
Hmm.
is mostly just because mostly for efficiency reasons. Like most of this is all of these methods actually come from the deep RL literature,
Hmm.
and so they wanted to do things like that were more principled, like predictive information gain, but come up with online estimates that were much faster, where you didn't need to compute things like KL or mutual information at on a per step. You didn't have to come up with estimators for those. And
Right.
so I agree that this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. I mean to
Hmm.
mention here, the reason I picked these three is because they're representative of the three kinds of leading ways that people, at least in the RL community, talk about model-based intrinsic motivation. But there's like dozens and dozens of different ways. Some of them are more principled than others, like, predictive information gain. There's also things like empowerment. There's many different intrinsic motivations. These are just I think, representative because it starts with the most simple of just doing pure forward prediction error, and then you have ensemble variance, which is an efficient estimator of Bayesian information gain, and then you have learning progress, which is dynamics. So the difference between that and PIG is that I guess the Bayesian information gain, it's not predicted information gain.
Mhm.
And um, so yeah, there's many different ways of doing this. Um,
So that's a very interesting point, and I don't know if we should discuss this now or keep it for later. But you mentioned this tension between elegant and principled approaches and
yeah.
approach that work. And another thing that is elegant, I think I really like empowerment, but as far as I know, I haven't seen examples of that being implemented and making it work at scale. So that's something that maybe we can discuss later. But I guess yeah, that tension exists, and it's worth taking into account.
Yeah, yeah. Without getting the details, it's really just because, um, yeah, I mean, the techniques used in reinforcement are so sample and efficient, at least when we're talking about policy gradient techniques. And model-free techniques that usually when people were coming from this literature, it was the case that they would actually start with something principled, like, hey, we want to estimate mutual information, but then they do it in a really hacky way, so they don't actually have to learn new estimators of that,
Hmm.
and lower bound, like learn variational approximations, so that then they come up with these kinds of really simple ways of doing it. And it's actually impressive though, because I'll show you some examples. They're really powerful, even though they're not mathematically complete. And they're not tight at bounds at all on some of these things.
Hmm.
Uh, so for
So
example, yeah,
I guess to work towards your paper, actually, one thing I'm noticing about all of these is that they're state oriented.
yeah.
So these aren't really telling you, what happens if I do anything in particular, which I could imagine would sort of be helpful,
Um,
in the sense that since I ultimately want to learn a policy, I might want an exploration bonus that, you know, says something to my policy or bears directly on action.
if I understand what you're saying, you're saying you're asking more about if these are like counterfactual in a way, like if I take an
Uh,
action. Is that
Not necessarily counterfactual, but they don't really seem to be, they seem to be functions of the log probability or the, ensemble variance of predicted states
Mhm.
rather than relationships between the state and the novel state, S prime and the
Ah,
action A.
yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So, um, there are other intrinsic motivations that are like that. So I won't get into details, but
Hmm.
empowerment, for example, is one. These ones, the coupling you're talking about, it's an interesting, that is a totally valid question. Like, why not have a model that tries to decode actions or something, or has some that just has to persist in carrying information about actions throughout a trajectory. But the reason we're doing this here is one, so remember this intrinsic reward is interfacing with the policy, which is learning a distribution over actions. So the policy does take an action, right? And then that action, this intrinsic drive will tell you from that action, can I predict the next state? And so, and the policy then has to predict the next action given the resulting S prime you end in. So there is a close coupling. It's not like these two things are very closely related, um, since eventually S prime goes back into the policy at the next step, and then you have to predict the next state. But these class of models I'm considering here, it's a smaller class than what you're saying. They're just model based in the sense that they're models of the environment, whereas the environment itself doesn't the MDP isn't defined by its ability to decode your actions from your states. But other intrinsic motivations do those things. So, um, But with these, what we can let me show you some examples of using these again. So since we talked about some of their limitations, it's actually pretty cool because they're really successful in some domains that are kind of actually notoriously complicated. Like, oh, actually, can you guys hear my sound? Did that play sound for all of you?
No.
No, okay, good. It's playing for me. I just don't want it to. Okay. So this is an example of the prediction error based agent playing Mario. And so you can see that it's actually playing the game pretty well, right? If we saw this game, we might think it's like a kid or even just a normal player who's never played before. But they're actually solving it really quickly. But then as soon as you go to maybe a level that's very different, suddenly like the policy just kind of tweaks out. And so, but why does this even work at all? The answer is one, your action space is discrete. So predicting, whether you should jump or move left, right, that's basically the three actions you can do. It happens to align quite well with the task of solving the game, right? The game, you just need to move right, right? So if you can predict when to move right and when to move up, that's kind of a lot of the game. The reason then it fails in this new
Also,
task, yeah,
that policy sucks at Mario.
relative to an expert, of course, but this is completely, oh, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me see if
No,
I
no,
can
I
find
mean,
it.
I mean, relative to a small child, like this thing is spamming the jump button and not really accomplishing much in exchange for those jumps.
Yeah, yeah, it's totally inefficient. The thing that we're emphasizing here is just by predicting the next state that you can even it beats the first few levels at all. It's very impressive considering it's completely unsupervised. Like it's not rewarded at all based on uh the actual score of the game. And so, yeah, is this like a good policy? It depends what good means. It's good relative to the fact that it's an unsupervised policy. Yeah, it's really good compared to a small child who obviously has much more capacity than this small little agent here. It's definitely not good. So good is relative. Um, so yeah, it might not seem impressive, but you know for if you're familiar with like the research and reinforcement learning, was actually a really big result because like otherwise this has never been done before where you could train like an agent to play a game without a reward function, without an extrinsic reward function. This is just doing self-supervised prediction in a CNN feature space. So it's pretty cool. But sort of to your point, I'm more interested in animal autonomy or just continuous control. And if we look at what happens when these same methods predict the next day, then you use that to drive actions, you get something like this, right? So this is like a swimming agent in sort of a fluid dynamics kind of simulation that I'm going to talk about later. But you can see it just sort of tweaks out. It has this ball over there that if we really wanted it to explore like a child, like it should go over there, see if it can move it, whatever. Maybe even learn to swim by doing that. But it doesn't, right? And so this I would say is not good. Not good, again, depends on what you're after. Here I'm after a self-supervised intrinsic motivation that actually learns the behaviors in the environment that are available to it. Like it should learn to swim or should learn to explore in this environment. But since really all it needs to explore in this environment is just by tweaking its joints, it doesn't do those things. Because even for continuous actions, right? If you just train an MLP to try to predict in this case is a five-dimensional agent, the next state, it's actually pretty easy to learn an MLP to do that. So you don't need to generate really interesting actions in order to saturate your prediction error. So that means that's a problem, right? Because I mean, it's clearly prediction error is not the right signal if this is the policy you can get away with by maximizing that. And so the where we're going with this is that we want to come up with alternatives. Like what is a different intrinsic reward that's still model based, but you use the model as just a substrate. You don't just take its prediction error and plug it in and assume that's going to work. We want to test, maybe it will, but we want to test the shortcomings of that on an actual animal behavior. Okay, so because we want to be able to benchmark these algorithms on behavioral data from a real animal and then down the line brain data. And so then the question is, where does that data set even come from, right? The problem in neuroscience, it's not really a problem, but if you want to study autonomy, it kind of is because in neuroscience and similar to machine learning, the ways that we design experiments are task optimized, right? So if I take like monkey data and I say, oh, like I'm interested in maybe autonomy in primates, any sort of monkey data set, right? It's been water deprived and it's been trained to solve a specific task in whatever way is most optimal for that monkey to receive its juice reward. Okay, so it's not an autonomous behavior because it's, again, we usually want to study controlled experiments where we're after a specific thing. So it's not a problem with the field. It's just that it's a more niche question, but it means that you can't just take any sort of off-the-shelf data because it's sort of been tainted. And so it's a task optimized behavior. Um, Interestingly, we found this data set in zebrafish. So here, this is kind of blurry. I apologize for that, but there's actually a zebrafish here that's swimming in virtual reality. And zebrafish, the reason why this is a good data set for us, because you actually, in zebrafish neuroscience, you don't usually really train them to do anything because they don't like to be trained. All of their behavior, hunting, foraging, predator avoidance, in this case, just exploration, is completely intrinsically motivated. So they're put in an environment and they just do these things and we record data from them doing them. So there's no task, there's no like food or water that we give it to try to get it to get to a certain position or solve a task or something like that. So what's going on here is that this zebrafish is in a fish tank that has no flow, and what's moving actually is a projected image on the bottom of the fish tank. And so the fish has electrodes that are recording from its tail, its motor neurons in its tail. And by swimming as it would try to, so it's head fixed right now, by moving its tail in a way that it would try to swim, that motor neuron activity is mapped to the gain of this drifting plane. Okay. And notice that it's even when it's not moving, it's drifting forward, right? So this simulates kind of the fish being pushed back by a current. So if you think about if the fish was in a real stream or something, if it saw its optic flow going that way, it would feel like it's moving back, even though it's not doing anything. And fish don't like that, so they like to resist that current. So then they just like to swim around in this environment because they think it's like an active current, so they're just navigating. And the textures here, of course, is so they can kind of see where they're at. And so what's going on here, the behavior that we actually have data for is in this environment because it's virtual, right? It's not a real fish tank, and it's not controlling the physics of the real water. You can mess with its sensory motor loop. So in closed loop, what you have is motor commands produce optic flow, right? It produces sensory feedback, which in this case is purely visual. And then you can break that sensory motor loop by just turning the gain down on your experiment, and so it doesn't get any visual feedback when you do your next motor command. So it turns out that even, again, there's this passive grading in the open loop, you turn off the gain, and the zebrafish will try to swim, and after a certain period of time, it'll just give up. And then it'll try again, see if things have changed, and it'll give up, and so on and so on. And so this is something called futility-induced passivity, because your actions are futile, they're not actually controlling the environment, and you become passive. So let me show you, before I explain the behavior a little more, let me show you some data. The other nice thing about zebrafish is in their larval stages, their head is completely transparent, which is pretty interesting, which means that you can, people have developed ways to, it's called light sheet microscopy, where they can image the whole brain simultaneously across a huge, basically, sheet. So they can get all these layers at the same time of the animal while it's behaving. Okay, so you can get whole brain data, which for a zebrafish is about 100,000 neurons. And in this case, they're also recording a type of cell called astrocyte, which is a glial cell that kind of is a non-firing type of brain cell that it sort of accumulates transient calcium at synaptic terminals and then propagates that calcium through long-range connections throughout the rest of the brain. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few trials from a real zebrafish in open loop. So this is when the sensory motor loop has been cut. So first of all, what you see is the whole brain is pretty silent when it's not moving, right? There's nothing really going on. And then as soon as it starts trying to swim and it's failing, there are these neurons that just light up like crazy across the whole brain. And then these astrocytes, these other types of cells, accumulate that calcium and hold on to it for a while afterwards. Okay, so you have this cycle where these neurons only fire when you're failing at swimming, and then these astrocytes are basically accumulating that calcium. And it seems like if you look at this plot over here, this is just plotting those dynamics. It seems like at a certain point that calcium reaches a critical threshold, and then suddenly, behavior turns off, and so these noradrenergic neurons also turn off. And so I won't show, I mean, this is a cell paper, so I can't show all 1,000 figures from this paper, but they basically did a bunch of experiments to show that these radioastrocytes are accumulating this error signal from these neurons that are firing only when the zebrafish is failing to swim, and it's accumulating that calcium. And the reason the behavior turns off because these astrocytes synapse onto GABAergic neurons downstream that are in the motor system, and so those GABAergic neurons silence the behavior. And so it's really these astrocytes accumulating this error signal like this, basically integrating this error and then reaching a threshold, and that turns off behavior, and then these noradrenergic neurons turn off as well. If I
Okay,
show you
so
like, yeah,
sorry, really, really idiotic physiology question here, but I
no,
gotta
no,
ask it.
can't guarantee you have an answer, but
If the radial astrocytes have integrated fire dynamics, what's the difference between them and neurons?
oh yeah, yeah. So I was tried to be careful not to say fire. I might have, but astrocytes don't actually fire. They
So
just
they don't spike.
they don't spike. They're a non-spiking cell. They just
Okay, so it reaches a threshold and then has a graded response.
exactly, it just releases calcium. It doesn't spike. It's basically like a almost like a neuromodulator, but it basically it's almost so think of a tripartite synapse. So when you have a presynaptic neuron that synapses onto the postsynaptic terminal, astrocytes will have a third kind of synapse that kind of wrap around that, and any extracellular calcium that's there, it'll pick up and it'll accumulate that in its cell body. And then based on how much calcium is in there, it'll also propagate that calcium downstream to other tripartite synapses. So it doesn't fire, it just accumulates calcium and then chooses by whatever process it chooses to release calcium at its downstream branches. Okay, so I showed you open loop. So if I show you closed loop, behavior is very different. So this is when it has control over its environment. You don't see this huge whole brain activation like we were seeing before. You of course see neurons firing, and of course when it swims, these are some. I mean, don't ask me details about the zebrafish brain. I'm not a zebrafish brain expert. These are just areas involved in the visual processing and motor neurons. But if I go back a slide, right, this is a hugely different brain response, right? Look at this whole brain activation across all layers, and then these radial astrocytes are releasing just as much calcium. It's really insane. And so what I want to emphasize here, if I go back to this behavior, um, why is this even interesting? Like, why is this interesting behavior? Okay, it's not driven by an extrinsic reward, fine, but it's a fish, like in a virtual reality. Like, why is this interesting for me? Um, on one hand, it's because if you abstract away that this is a fish, the behavior of giving up when you can't control your environment, this is ubiquitous, right? All animals kind of have this intrinsic drive. In fact, this is part of a more general experimental assay just called learned helplessness, right? It's when you can't predict or control the relationship between a stimulus and response, and maybe that in some learned helplessness assays that stimulus shocks you or whatever. In this case, it doesn't. But the point is, if there's some relationship there that you can't predict or control, then you go into a passive state or helpless state where you no longer try to even act, even if the environment might change. Like you don't try to pursue the actions that you would have otherwise. And so this is a behavior like that even humans have, right? If I try to open a locked door and it's locked, I wouldn't just, try to turn that handle infinitely because I know I have a model of the environment that says the lock's not just going to magically open. I either need to come back later, the dynamics have changed, or, I need to find a key or something. And so giving up after you realize you can't control your environment is this is just a general thing. Um, Now, is that really why the zebrafish is giving up? So that's the next question, like why is it turn off? The most obvious answer is because it's just tired or it just doesn't, it's out of energy. I won't show the data for this, but again, it's in the cell paper if you're interested in. But it's actually not, the authors do a bunch of experiments and controls to show it's actually not an energy deprivation or metabolic constraint at all. The zebrafish have enough energy in a variety of conditions to swim as much as they want. It's not because they're trying to conserve it or anything like that. It's not because of this homeostatic drive I mentioned, like this fish, likes to swim because it's pushed back. But it turns out even if you replay sequences of the ground plane moving from other trials from the same fish, it still gives up. So because it knows that my actions didn't actually cause this change in the ground plane. So it knew that even though the ground plane was moving, it knew it wasn't moving from its actions. And so it still gave up, which means that it's not just this arbitrary goal, like I want to keep moving, I want to keep resisting this current. Because if it was, then if you when you replay those other trials, it would be fine with that. It would just keep swimming because, it could get to where it wants to go. Again, so that combined with the energy thing, it really is because this ubiquitous intrinsic drive that like animals, don't like to do things, don't take actions or be in states where they have no control over their environment. And so that's why it's interesting. And nicely because we have whole brain data and it's a simple like 1D behavior in this case of just turning off. Okay, so that's the behavior. Let me see where I'm at here. Okay, so we want to of course capture this in the framework I've been talking about, and so this is where we design the virtual agent. So here we give the virtual agent two inputs. It's going to be driven by vision and proprioception. Again, because this is the main sensory modalities that are relevant in the actual experiment, right? The zebrafish isn't really swimming, so it doesn't use olfaction. There's no food in the environment to navigate to things like that. So really the dominant sensory modality here is vision, as well as you of course need to know that you're moving. So you have proprioception. Here, the vision model, this is just a small ResNet that's actually matched to the relative kind of architecture of the zebrafish visual system. That doesn't really matter. And the proprioception, it just gets its joint velocities relative to its local state. And that's encoded with just a small MLP. So then these features are fed into just a recurrent actor critic network. So this is just nothing special here. You just have what we're going to call it the core module, but it's really just the learns the value function, which is the expected discounted reward. And then there's a policy module which just learns a stochastic policy. So it's a distribution over actions given your current hidden state. Um, and then the important part here is that those features, though, are then going to get passed into the intrinsic drive module, which is just a feed-forward network that implements a bunch of different algorithms. So, for example, we talked about some of these before. I can talk about what these other ones are if you're curious. But basically, the intrinsic drive module, it implements the world model that we've been talking about, but in feature space, right? So these are operating on the concatenated visual and proprioceptual features, and then it tries to predict the next feature. And because these features are tied to the world model, this is just the same thing, but in now feature space. And now each of these different, like I've listed some of the baselines we're going to be using here. Each of these different algorithms, like we've talked about, use that world model in different ways. So like ICM, which is just the name of like basically the curiosity algorithm, will just use the prediction error directly. So that's VT plus one. It'll use that prediction error directly, whereas other ones use them in different ways. So this is basically our hypothesis class. What are the kind of state-of-the-art model-based intrinsic motivations that we can compare against? And basically what I'm going to show is that the algorithm that we propose here, it's called 3M progress, will allow you to go back and color in the units of this RNN here to match actually the computational roles of the circuit that I showed you earlier. So I'll explain the details of that, but that's where we're headed. And the actual embodiment here, just for
There's a
convenience.
question,
Yeah,
Reese.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious about the maxent. Is that just regular sort of like policy maxent? You're doing maxent on the policy, or is it also because there's also these like state maximum entropy things that some people use. So I was curious, is it
Yeah, that's a great question. So maxent refers to the policy entropy. So in line with the maxent reinforcement learning, but what you're referring to, state entropy, that's more of like novelty. And so this algorithm random network distillation, it doesn't take the entropy of your states, but if you've I don't know if people are familiar with this, but basically it tries to just predict your observation a random projection of your observations, which is a estimate of your state novelty, which is the same thing as entropy. So this is one example. If you were thinking of like, well, what about state novelty as measured by entropy? This is a close analog to that. But this max ent one is like you said, it's just the policy entropy. Okay, so that's the brain of the zebrafish. Pretty straightforward. Now the actual environment it swims in or exists in is a physics simulation in Majoko. So this is a 5 degrees of freedom here. It's torque actuated. The important part is that it has a fluid approximation, right? So the important part about fluid dynamics of our fish here is just that it captures the fundamental trade-off between propulsion and drift, right? So it's not like we're not solving the Navier-Stokes here. It's just simulates the individual forces on each of these bodies that according to a certain fluid approximation, you would experience given a certain force that you exert on the environment. All the observations are egocentric, right? So its vision is through its eyes, and the proprioception is local. It doesn't get like global state coordinates or anything. Um, and then another notable point here is the dynamics of the environment are non-stationary. So I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but we train it with active currents that it has to swim against passive currents. This is just the world that it lives in. And now over here, you'll see this weird environment on the right. This is actually a what's the word? Reconstruction of the experimental protocol that the data was collected in. So this is that ground plane that will be moving. I think it's a video actually. Okay, it's not. Sorry about that. This is a ground plane that's moving against the zebrafish. So here it's head fixed, just like that video I showed you, and it'll try to swim. Obviously it can't because of the head is fixed at this root joint here. And then it sees this passive grading where the size of the bar and the fish here is all matched to the relative sizes from the real data.
Actually, I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
So I love this experimental setup, and the theoretical framework is great. I'm wondering, the proprioceptive feedback, I'm assuming, is different. Like when you say head fixed, I think what you mean is that you've got a fish in agar, right? It's in jello. So when it tries to wiggle its tail doesn't actually move as far as it would. So the proprioceptive feedback is distorted in a couple of ways, right? And I'm wondering, are you modeling that or?
Yeah, that's a great point. So like the videos I showed you before where it's head fixed, it's not actually in like a super hot viscous fluid. So it's actually in something very close to water. So it can move its tail relatively ethologically. Yeah. Even in the how should I say? When they are using something like agar, it can still move its tail, but like you said, it's going to be distorted in some way. The proprioception feedback we're using here is very, very primitive. We're not actually modeling, the skin or any mechanoreceptors or anything like that. We're just, again, so since the embodiment is just this 5-link torque actuation here, the proprioception is just it's constricted to what those joints experience. So
I see.
Yeah.
So essentially, there's no difference in your model. There's no difference between what the animal experiences when it flicks its tail. Like it's as if you're assuming that proprioception is as it would have been in the natural situation.
Yep.
When it flicks its tail, as if even if there are some differences in the actual setup, where the visual shifting underground plane doesn't really agree with the actual flow of water around the animal.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the virtual agent design. So this is everything from its observations to actions, and then where those observations come from and where those actions go in the actual environment. And again, the reason we're building this head fixed environment, it's in addition to embodying this and making it look like this to be cute, the real reason is because this visual system, we want to expose it to visual inputs that match the statistics of what the conditions under which the real data was recorded, right? Because where we're going is we're going to compare this model's activations to the real zebrafish data. And so basically we want to build as convincing model as possible. So for this means it's stimulus computable, which in our case is just image computable, and it has semi-realistic physics, right? It has to capture the fundamental physics. It doesn't have to be a full fidelity simulation. Okay, so before I talk about the 3-in-progress algorithm, I just want to show you some qualitative results. So here, what I'm plotting here is the activity trace of the zebrafish agent as it undergoes a trial. So the x-axis here is time, so an episode, and the y-axis, these different traces are different model checkpoints. And within a checkpoint, these up and down, this is the swim power. So max swim power is up here, and no actions down here. And so right off the bat, right, what do you see from these other algorithms? So the first thing I see, right, is that as you go across learning, these all converge to a sort of stationary policy. What I mean by that is if you look at the dynamics of an episode, they just do the same thing, right? So this is learning progress here. They're kind of at full power the entire episode, whereas random network distillation, which is more of like state novelty, this is at full, almost, I mean, there's some noise here, but it's basically at full passivity the entire trial. And then disagreement maybe has like a switch to off, and then it stays off, and there's a lot of noise around surrounding that. Again, which makes sense because there's maybe like 5 different MLPs here that have small fluctuations in their predictions, but overall it's passive state, which is not what we want. So what do we want? Let me show you a trial from real zebrafish. So this top barcode is from a real zebrafish where here black is the active state, so it's trying to swim, and gold is passive. And so you can see the real behavior is characterized by, a quick active burst to see what's going on, and then a long passive burst. So this scale bar here is about a minute. So like up to a minute, you can just be sitting and doing nothing. And there's sort of a quick exploratory burst out of that to just see if the dynamics have changed. And then you switch back when you realize they haven't. So that's what we're looking for. And you can see, I'll explain why it does this before, but you can see the proposed algorithm captures that kind of structure nicely. So if we just look at, for example, a rollout from our agent here, we get a nice barcode. Whereas gamma progress, which is the closest algorithm mechanistically to 3M progress, again, descends, at least in this rollout, started active and then stayed passive the entire trial. And so I'll explain, the details of this in a second. But the question here is, okay, like I'm claiming these fail and don't capture this behavior. Why do these curiosity-driven methods fail? The first answer is that the intrinsic reward in all of these cases is basically proportional in one way or the other. It's mathematically related to the prediction error. And what that means is your learner is non-stationary, right? Your world model is trying to reduce its prediction error. And eventually, if assuming the dynamics in your environment are learnable up to some aleatoric uncertainty, this is going to saturate to some, minimum error, right? And so the consequence of that is when this saturates, when your prediction error stabilizes, the policy, that means the reward stabilizes and the policy doesn't get gradients, a learning signal anymore, right? So this is going to be really noisy and it's not going to converge to a policy that actually explores because your learning signal converged to flat, which means that's basically, if it flatlines, then your policy that's supposed to be choosing action at every step, if you keep learning on a flat learning signal, you don't get any gradients to update your policy. And so you descend into this transient behavioral strategies. The other issue is that some of these algorithms, like we kind of talked about this before with the noisy TV problem, they actually encourage perseveration on aleatoric uncertainty. So there's some entropy or some randomness in the environment that you can't reduce with your model class. You actually get rewarded for that because there's no mechanism to adapt away from that. Some of these have that mechanism, like gamma progress, or we talked about info gain or disagreement. But some of these don't, like random network distillation or ICM. And so you end up perseverating on something that is either unlearnable, in the case of it being like a random stimulus, you can't predict that, or it's uncontrollable, which means that if you choose a specific action and it has sort of a random outcome, you also can't predict that. And so there's a degeneracy there. And of course, real animals, right? These have relationship to them both. Real animals, like in this example behavior here, but also in general, they don't descend into a fixed they don't descend into a stationary policy where they don't do anything throughout the trial. Their behavior is always dynamic. We want it to descend into maybe something that's robust and stable over episodes, like maybe this guy over here, but it doesn't descend into something that doesn't do anything at all, right? And the other thing is that, of course, we know animals don't perseverate on unlearnable stimuli, right? If there's something they can't control in their environment, like they see, an experimentist hand waving, indefinitely over their cage, like they don't go and try to like, just stare at it forever and ever, trying to understand something when their actions have no causal control. And so these are the really basic, right, things that's okay. Like maybe your learning signal shouldn't saturate, and maybe you should have a mechanism that avoids perseveration. Some of these have that mechanism. But these are the basic principles that animal exploration should have that we need to make sure an exploration algorithm has as well. And so that's going to drive sort of the ingredients of 3M progress. before I move on, is there any questions about that? Okay. So, when we saw these algorithms fail, like these are basically the canonical model-based ways of doing self-supervised exploration. And we're like, well, okay, it's not actually surprising in some sense. And so if we want to design a normative model from scratch, the what is the right question to ask? And for me, sorry, the last time I gave this talk, I was in Portugal, and so I was making it location relevant, but it's still relevant here. There's this guy named Henry the Navigator. You might, if you know more about history than I do, he was one of the princes during the Portuguese navigation era, and he was sort of famous for, well, among many things, for sort of pioneering a lot of the navigational tools that the Portuguese Navy used. And one of those tools was the astrolabe, which basically just measures your angle relative to the sun. So you see like where you were longitudinally, and use that to navigate. But the other thing that he was popular for, maybe you guessed this, like actually if you were in the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or did a lot of backpacking or anything, where you don't use online maps, right? At least when I did this, what you would use is compass, right? Both of these things, a compass and a astrolabe, the thing they have in common is that they're a one-dimensional signal, right? So it's really low D, but it's still really powerful because like if you're in San Francisco, north of you, so I'm from Washington, north of you is Washington, you just knowing that and having a compass that tells you whether you're going towards Washington or not is really useful for getting around. So it's really powerful, even though it's so low D. And so the question is, if you have this prior of north, right? You don't have to go north, right? The compass is just saying where you're headed relative to north. What is the north for discovering new behaviors, for exploring? So if you want to explore new stuff, what is new relative to? What is the prior for, like, what's the equivalent of having that magnetic needle? And the answer, well, at least part of the answer, is that, of course, animals develop in an ecological niche, right, where they build up priors about the world, or maybe those priors are endowed by the genome. It doesn't really matter. But at least one type of prior is the physics of your environmental niche, right? So if you're in this MDP, that's, let's say for the zebrafish, it's like its freshwater stream. Um, then in that MDP, you have some notion of like what the dynamics should look like. Like, that if you tried to swim around when it wasn't agar or when it wasn't, some viscous thing, what kind of state you would end up in. And you can use that basically in new environments. So now if you go into a new environment, you're put into the experimental protocol. The question is, if you have that ecological niche, if you can maintain that somehow, then basically you can structure exploration in a way such to maintain a relative exploration to that niche. So the way this is going to work is, imagine like you're sort of pointing in this blue direction here, and this is the sort of transition kernel of your new environment. The idea is you want to explore using that prior memory as a compass. So imagine that in your new environment, there's a subspace of states and actions where the physics agree. So like in the zebrafish example, this might be if you put it from a freshwater stream into a water fish tank, a lot of the dynamics are going to agree, at least the physics of the water, let's say, when it's still. But then when it maybe hits a border, then that's not something like a glass wall. That's not physics it's seen before. And the idea is that an agent can explore by either pursuing transitions that move it into these familiar physics. So it can take an action where the next state you end up in obeys the same kind of physics as your ecological niche. Or you can, again, just like the compass idea, you don't have to go north. You can also choose actions that move you out of your niche. And the point is, the normative model here is that if you have this as a prior signal, then whatever your actions do, whether it's in or out, you can basically straddle that perimeter of your ecological niche and sort of to explore relative to that. So there's some abstract border where the physics of your new environment disagree with the physics of your old environment. And the normative model is basically you want to straddle that border and stay near it. And so intuitively, this is kind of like, at least in my head, it's kind of related to like computation at the edge of chaos. So you have some critical point where small change in your parameters will cause some explosion in dynamics. This border between these MDPs is kind of like that, where a small change will suddenly push you really far away from north. So you don't exactly want to be in one or the other, but you want to be at a point near that edge of chaos. And then in a way that kind of affords you the most computational power. So this is a sort of behavioral equivalent of that with the dynamics model. And so how do we actually implement this? Okay, this will, if you're having questions, I think this might clear some things up, and then we can talk about after. There's two stages. So in the active pre-training stage, this is where you build up that ethological memory of what the dynamic should be like. So here the zebrafish is just swimming around, freely swimming to food. It can resist currents. The point is that while it's in this environment, it learns a model of the transition dynamics via experience, right? So it's just observing the consequence of actions, and it builds up that internal model that we've been talking about. Now, using that internal model, that's going to serve as your north, like your fixed prior, and you're going to bring that into your exploration phase. So now when it's in the experimental protocol and it's head fixed, it experiences a new type of physics, right? Now it's whatever action it takes, it sees this sort of constant next state. So it's definitely different from the dynamics of the old environment. And this time, you're also going to distill a new memory, but you're going to have this old memory that you can reference. So here, this epsilon is just some residual between these two memories um, that measures how far away you are, right? So for us, we're modeling these as distributions. So our residual, we can use a KL distance, but if this were, yeah, if memories are implemented otherwise, it would be different, or we could choose a different metric here. But the point is that this epsilon is just capturing sort of how far away this distribution is, my online memory distribution is from, sorry, my online model distribution is from my memory of what the dynamic should be like. And what this does, right, KL is basically either zero or it's positive, right? It's always greater than zero. So this loosely partitions the behavioral space into two modes. There's a niche seeking mode, right? This would be when your distributions are aligned and your KL would be low. Or there's a niche avoidance mode, right? Where you would actually leave your ecological niche, pick actions that disagree with the physics, and your KL would be really high on that new learned dynamics distribution. And so this is the residual, and we want to use that residual to structure behavior of leaving and going back and entering these two things. So what we do is we need to be able to track this in time. So similar to learning progress, which say, hey, basically want to take a derivative of the signal. One easy way to do that, to track this pink guy in time, is just with a leaky integrator, right? So an exponential moving average. And if we plot that in time, right, this is just going to slowly track the epsilon signal. And by taking the difference between this pink and green, then we get relatively how fast things are moving and where I'm at relative to this slowly moving memory. So our intrinsic reward here is just simply the difference between those two things. Here, the absolute value is just a normative choice. We want this to be sort of symmetric so that you straddle that border between niche seeking and niche avoidance. But it can be any symmetric function as long as it rewards both. So what you get is this nice kind of smooth, kind of dense reward that tells you this is great if you're in your niche, but you don't want to always stay there. You should try to explore outside of your niche. And then after some time scale, you should return back to the physics of your niche. And so that's what it kind of looks like. And I should say, one thing I forgot to mention is that that's actually quite important. I really shouldn't have forgotten to say this, is that the real reason we're doing all this model-based uh, intrinsic motivation is because from the neural data, we know that the zebrafish's behavior is from some type of sensory motor dynamics model, right? Because it's not energy and because it's not, homeostatic drives, the zebrafish really gives up because it's computing this error signal, right? There's neurons were firing when it was trying to swim, but failing to swim. And so in order for there to be that error signal, there needs to be, a ground truth, right? So it needs to actually have some type of sensory motor model of the world of how the dynamic should evolve under the normal circumstances, the closed loop situation, so that in the open loop situation, the neurons know to fire, right? So the fact that error exists means there's some type of prior. And so that's why we're in this model-based land. Okay, so with that said, is there any questions about this before I show the more stuff?
Yeah, I had a question about So what would be the alternatives to this particular model of niche seeking? Like what would be like what is the main alternative that you had in mind when designing the model? Maybe you're gonna mention it later, but
Yeah.
just...
Yeah, you know what? That's a great. So let me answer that in the next slide. So I'll talk about on the next slide. I'll sort of show our kind of baseline models. I'll
Cool.
discuss a little bit about that. But is there any questions about sort of the uh, conceptually about the normative model here? And if not, that's totally fine, and we can come back to it if there is. But I'll just say one more time is that it's actually quite simple when you take away the notation. Maybe if it already looks simple, that's great. It really is just about you have a prior, you have some fixed signal, and you just want to take that into new environments to explore, and you explore relative to that. So here, then, as long as you have that prior, what we're adding on top of that is the normative intrinsic objective, which is to say, go try to find that prior and explore around it. So relative to a margin around that how things differ from your prior. And in this case, our prior is a dynamics model, but the prior, it's just a prior. Um, but the reason it's a dynamics model, again, is because we know the zebrafish, those neurons are computing some type of sensory motor prediction error. Otherwise, they wouldn't be firing, only in the case where it's open loop and they're failing to swim. And so that's why it's kind of a nice mapping onto model-based exploration RL, um, because it's actually one-to-one in this case. So, okay. I showed you some of the behavioral results. So I just want to point out, now that we have this agent, the next thing we just want to do is say, how well does this predict neural data? Okay. So of course, when we're comparing neural networks to the brain, you have to ask what kind of metric are you going to use? And so the philosophy in kind of neuro AI, I think, but in large, but also in our lab, is that we want to use the same metric that achieves the best score when you use two animals of the same species. So this is what we call inter-animal alignment. So for example, monkeys, what this means, if you're more familiar with primates or even humans, is that if you take one monkey and let's say you want to predict motor cortex from one subject, one individual monkey to another, sort of the metric that gets you the best predictive model in that case is linear regression, right? So you have to pick some type of class of models. And for monkeys, we use linear regression because there's not a one-to-one correspondence between neurons and motor cortex or anywhere for that matter. So you have to like weight the population activity just to predict one neuron in the target. You have to weight the source. For humans, right, we use like RSA, lots of other techniques. For zebrafish, the inter-animal alignment, if you look at RSA or if you look at linear regression, you actually don't need those. So there's so much homogeneity between two individual zebrafish that if you pick any neuron in one individual, you can find a neuron in another individual that perfectly correlates with this activity. Okay, so you don't need to weight neurons. You actually just look for every neuron in my target, find the most correlated unit in my source, and I'm going to use that as my predictor. And it turns out the most correlated unit on average is perfectly correlated. So it's not like, you know, the most correlated unit is only 70% Pearson's R. You actually get a unit that's perfectly correlated with the target source. So we're actually just using one unit, whether it's a glial cell or it's a neuron, as the predictive model of the other. And that's our baseline because that's what works for zebrafish. So it's a strong metric, right? Because you're not allowed to build an arbitrary mapping, right? You actually just have to find a unit that is perfectly predicted. And so when we do that, what we find is actually the three in progress agent, the agent that captures the behavior the best, is actually saturates this benchmark. And so I'll talk about that. May be like sound crazy, but I'll actually just say a little bit in a second about why there's some caveats to that. But it still is actually quite impressive. So the models that really don't capture the behavior, it turns out that they don't predict neural data, which is hopefully something that we would agree that it would happen, but it's something that actually needs to be confirmed. Because even in some cases, right, like some of these other models, like the curiosity ones, it's actually surprising how much of neural data they do predict, even though they don't capture the behavior. And there's a lot of flexibility there and what it means to to predict this specific data set. So that's why there's some caveats. For example, like the zebrafish data, like I mentioned before, is rather homogeneous, right? So the whole brain during this behavior kind of goes into a single mode. There's not that much, I mean, there's a lot of variability, but if you plot the mean, for example, and then also look at the PCs, they're pretty much the same thing. Um, and so that's why you can get away with actually predicting, in this case, almost like 60%, right, of the neural data without actually capturing this behavior of switching on and off. And it's pretty surprising. What's more surprising is that if you use a data-derived approach, so this is not an embodied model, you just fit a Gaussian process to this neural data, it actually still doesn't predict individual units. So this is average across glial and neural data, by the way. Doesn't predict individual units with as much fidelity as the embodied agent. And that's even true for if you take the whole brain average and you try to predict, et cetera, et cetera. Now, someone asked a second ago about like what's an alternative model here? Like obviously we're just coming up with a model, so this isn't. There's two answers to this. One is within the realm of model-based algorithms. This really is the next simplest. Like we didn't make a crazy sort of assumption here about what the algorithm should be. We just said instead of doing prediction error, you should do prediction error against the prior. And so all of these other model-based algorithms, they don't have priors because, again, in deep learning, we like to make as few assumptions about as possible. So a good exploration mechanism, at least in the RL community, is like, well, just don't make any assumptions. Just have an algorithm that works in any type of situation, which makes sense. But it turns out for animal behavior, animals have assumptions, and so just an algorithm without priors, it turns out, isn't actually strong enough to capture the behavior. And so this was just the next simplest extension. So you can kind of see that why it's called even gamma progress or theorem progress, because we're just taking the same ideas and say, what is the minimal sufficient thing you need to capture this behavior? And it's actually just a prior about what sensory motor dynamics model. And so that's one answer. The other answer is that the most obvious thing, like when you first look at this behavior, right, you're like, oh, it's just turning off. So why can't I just look at those neural traces of error accumulation and integration and just write down a PID controller? And you definitely can. So you can just hard code a model to do this. One problem with that is actually doesn't predict the variance in neural data. So even though it captures the motif of what we're saying, like yes, fire when there's error, and turn off once this other signal has reached a critical threshold, you can totally just write down a controller for that. But it's not actually a good model of individual neurons for the whole data set, even though it captures what you would think would be a good model of individual neurons. The other problem was that even though a PID controller like that does capture that motif of like error signaling firing, you as the experimenter kind of built in the fact that what is the error, where it's coming from, et cetera. Like you're hard coding the behavior to turn off at this specific point, accumulate the error for this amount of time steps and things like that. And that's all fine. Like we always have to make assumptions, but it's just not as clean because this is completely self-supervised and just taking the idea that, okay, we know this real zebrafish actually does have a forward model of the environment. If it didn't, it wouldn't have this error signal. And so can we turn that forward model into the most general, just like plug it in to a general objective that's not specific to turning off, but generates turning off behavior when we want it to. And so that's kind of the reason for that. The other thing is if we now just look at the behavioral alignment, so this is what I was showing you before when we get ups and downs, that barcode, and we just plot that against the model brain alignment, where we're going with embodied neural AI is really whatever the interanimal alignment here, this star is, you really just want to be close. This is the neural AI Turing test in a sense. You want to be as close to behavior and brain alignment as possible. And this is sort of looking towards a model of the brain that actually behaves like the brain. So you don't want to just arbitrarily walk the walk either. You want it to be a model of the brain. And the converse is if you build a predictive model of the brain, does it actually support a decision making, like a policy, in a way that would produce that behavior? And so that's sort of the motivation for, or at least part of the motivation for the embodied side of embodied neural AI. Does anybody have any questions about this?
Yeah, I think this is very remarkable that the unsupervised model captures both neural data and behavior well. But as you said earlier, it's also very surprising that the data-driven models are not capturing the neural data. And if I remember correctly, I think I saw somewhere that if you look at the principal components of zebrafish neural activity, maybe two or three principal components capture almost all of the variance. So it's a very low dimensional signal. And
Yep. Yep.
so can you help us understand why all these other models fail to capture that kind of low dimensional neural data?
Yeah. Okay, before I answer that, let me actually just show the next slide because it's
Okay.
related. So we were looking just like so in that last plot we were looking at individual cells, right? How does the neurons from the RNN in our zebrafish agent predict individual neurons and astrocytes? But like since Hadi mentioned this, I'll show this first. We can also look at the latent dynamics too. And so if you look at the zebrafish PCA, so this is on the right, actually it's not even PC, this is just the mean activity. And I mentioned this before, the like Hadi said, the first two PCs of a zebrafish data can often capture the whole brain activities, and at that point, which also would mean just mathematically that there's really close to the mean activity. And so right now we're not plotting PCs on the right, just the mean. But for our zebrafish agent, we plot PCs, and what you can see is that for the active to passive transitions, where you have this accumulate and then decay, and then sorry. These pink guys are the noradrenergic neurons. So these are firing for the error and then decay when they get turned off by the calcium signals from the glia. And this looks a little weird here because it's normalized. So this is the same plot I showed earlier when I was showing the raw neural data. But this is calcium from neurons and astrocytes on slightly different scales. So maybe I shouldn't plot it this way. But this really is a firing here, and this really is actually an accumulation, even though it looks like it's not accumulating that much. But the first two PCs of the zebrafish agent capture that pretty well. So you can see the first PC is basically like an noradrenergic neuron, where it's really active while the zebrafish agent is trying to move. And then the second PC is ramping up until this onset to passivity, in which case the noradrenergic neurons decay and the drop to zero because you're not signaling that error anymore. And the second PC captures that astrocyte decay as well. And you can also do this for the other direction, so switching from the passive state back to active. Because the important part about this behavior is that it doesn't stay passive forever, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be interesting. It's really important actually that the zebrafish goes back to activity, right? Because that's the essence of the exploratory behavior. Zebrafish do that. All animals do that because we know that the real world, the dynamics aren't stationary, right? Things can change if I come back later on. So zebrafish go back to the active state after they've been passive. But the problem is like most reinforcement learning algorithms aren't designed for non-stationary MDPs, right? The dynamics of the environment has to be fixed in order for the policy to learn a stable, optimal policy. So without breaking RL algorithms, this is part of the reason why like you can get away with the behavioral consequences of an agent behaving as if the dynamics were non-stationary, even in an algorithm that assumes stationary MDP with the right kind of if you put that bias in somewhere else, in this case, the bias of the intrinsic motivation. Um, okay, so just to mention this really quickly, this is part of the promise of embodied neural AI is to that you can propose, and in this case, validate a behaviorally relevant circuit in closed loop, right? So I think personally that's really cool is to take circuit hypotheses from systems neuroscience, say like, oh, we really think this kind of motif generates this behavior. Well, you can basically just build that into a agent and see actually whether that signal is strong enough and robust enough to generate that behavior, or it's playing a different type of role, or vice versa. If there's a behavior you want to match, you can sort of benchmark or see if that circuit hypothesis is really necessary, or if you can, again, capture that behavior with a different type of algorithm. Okay, so to go back for a second to Hadi's question, the question was sort of like, why can these other algorithms do so well? I mean, Hadi kind of answered it a little bit, but so why these algorithms can sort of predict so much of this whole brain data? And it really is because if you think about, if I go to the next slide for a second again, if you look at this is the signal we're trying to predict, right? So basically, I mean, this is the average response. There is variance, uh, whole brain variance, of course. But this is a pretty simple signal, right? So there needs to be a unit in your neural network that is on when you're swimming and then off when you're not. And there needs to be a unit that that ramps up and turns off. And so in these other models, you can totally have a unit that's on um, and then off when you're active and passive just by nature of the actual controller. Like if you're when you're off, there's definitely going to be neurons in your value function that tell you that are correlated with the units in your policy that tell you to be off. But they're not off for the right reasons, right? Like three in progress is off because you've recently were in your dynamics niche. So then you recently were outside of your dynamics niche, so then you move into your niche to be off. And so the reason why you're pursuing the zero action is because of having this model of what the dynamic should be like. And so that's why you get better predictivity. So the fact that this is predictive at all, though, tells you that basically it's this difference that comes in that matters for, actually getting the intrinsic drive right, getting like what the priors are correct, and not so much the raw predictive score. Because you could totally use like this guy ICM here as a predict. Let's say we didn't have three in progress, like we could totally use it to predict neural data, um, but it's kind of on the wrong footing because it didn't capture the behavior. So then, if you're not capturing the behavior, it's kind of, I mean, neural data is in general like it's not clear what's really going on. So if the actual agent isn't capturing the behavior, even if it has high correlation or high predictive power with the neural data, lots of random, you could be doing a totally random different behavior and also predict this neural data well. So kind of doing the behavior is sort of a first filter because it's kind of meaningless to really call this a predictive model of the neural data when it doesn't do the behavior because there's lots of other predictive, you could arbitrarily design a predictive model. Like you train an agent to do something else and it could be predictive of this signal. Um, so yeah, part of it is because the data is quite low dimensional. Part of it is because really this gap is what matters because the reason why you can get even like the switch to passivity in some of these other models, um, where this is not back is because it doesn't have the extra mechanism that 3M progress does, which is the spot. It has an extra slot for a prior, whereas these other algorithms don't compare to like any sort of ground truth.
Mhm. And I guess let me raise another caveat here. If we didn't have 3M and we were looking at the other models and then assigning some sort of brain score to them, we would say, oh, ICM is a better model of zebrafish than the other ones because it's slightly better in its prediction. But even though we know that it's mechanistically just wrong, it's missing
Hmm.
that prior component. So I guess, yeah, the fact that this model gets almost perfect predictions for neural activity as well as exhibits the behavioral motifs, I think maybe like this should be the standard for predicting for neuro AI as Aran and you are establishing here. But I guess yeah, it's hard to
Yeah,
require this for
no,
monkeys.
no, and it shouldn't. Yeah, that's why I want to emphasize that
Yeah.
getting one is absolutely not a requirement. Like we're only able to do that because it's
Mhm.
in plain words, the data set is rather simple. What matters is like really the difference between the model that, performs the best and the model that doesn't. So even if, for example, let's say we're doing this in primates or rodents even, and the model saturated at like 60% of the variance, it would what you would expect there is still the model with the right mechanisms is more predictive. Like they capture the behavior is more predictive than these other models. So everything should shift down. It doesn't need to be a perfect, like this was just lucky in the sense that the zebrafish behavior is simple enough that we could, like the brain is like unimodal enough in this behavior that we can get 100%. But for any other animal model or even other zebrafish behaviors, that's not realistic.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So definitely
I
don't
wanted to
look at
ask,
100% and be like, oh, it's a perfect model of the brain. The zebrafish is just, yeah.
Mhm.
yeah, I wanted to ask a question related more to the models that perform well in behavior and not so much in brain alignment. So maybe you explained this and I missed it, but is there a principled reason why a model that capture like this particular model not only performs the behavior, which is kind of intuitive, but also develops like these kind of separate modules for with the separate dynamics that we can see in the zebrafish data and in the model data.
Yeah, yeah. So this is not to say, yeah. So I want to emphasize and answer your question that let me go back to, oops, that it's not like we designed this intrinsic drive. Um, let me see. Okay, sorry, I skipped it a little bit. Sorry for flashing all this. Okay. Um, one more. Okay. So as for, yeah, what is the reason why this specific algorithm gets both the behavior and why it has specialized modules? In one sense, it's because we designed it to be that way. But we designed it to be that way not to capture the zebrafish data, but because the specific behavior here of just exploring relative to the niche is just actually a general idea that goes beyond switching on and off specifically. For the real zebrafish data, switching on and like going between your niche and a new environment happens to map onto switching on and off because the niche is open world and the experimental protocol, the only action that is available to you is like all action. The only action that's commensurate with your niche is the zero action, right? And in this environment, you put a zero action out, you won't move. In this environment, you put a zero action, you also won't move. Whereas any other action, there's going to be disagreement. And so it's almost like the choice of experiment is what, in this case, what caused this to be aligned. But as for the mode specialization, it's really like so I should have put the circuit in this diagram too because these are sort of color coded. So what are the neurons doing? Like the neurons are detecting error and firing for the sensory motor prediction error. That's essentially what the noradrenergic neurons are doing. And then so we color code it with the same color to say that this is basically the computationalization of that. So even though it's inspired by these noradrenergic neurons, this error signal is really general, just in the same way that reward prediction error is really general. This is just a dynamics error, and so that's basically why the specialization of the value function, why you can get models that predict neurologic neurons, because there's a piece in your value function that the signal your value function is trying to predict is basically a neurogenic neuron. It's firing when your sensory motor dynamics error is large. And then this green guy here, this is tracking your air signal in time, kind of like a derivative. But that's exactly what astrocytes are doing. Astrocytes are leaky integrators of the calcium signal, which is the signal that we're predicting here. And it happens to map onto the exact mechanism you need to have an adaptive behavior that's being tracked in time. Well, you need some sort of slow accumulation, and then you can compare that in time. So then we also basically have an astrocyte module of a leaky discrete time integrator. And then your intrinsic reward, which is what the actual module has to predict, is then a mishmash of these, right? It's almost like you subtract these so it observes that difference. But to track that difference and motivate the behavior, it needs to have units that are specialized then to try to, in order to predict the future reward, right? It needs to have units that are specialized for predicting this green guy and this pink guy. So then those modules emerge in the agent by nature of having the right intrinsic motivation.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah.
I had a question, or maybe, yeah, about this slide, and so I want to try to interpret your active pre-training phase as simulating development. Going back to this question of nature versus nurture, this kind of like built-in prior maybe is nature, and for zebrafish, maybe that's really mostly just constrains their behavior. And there's even empirical papers on this from Daniel Barabasi and Florian Ingart that zebrafish are mostly predetermined. So is this a correct way to think about what you're doing? You're just
Yeah.
simulating development in that
No,
phase.
that's a great point. So like part of this, yeah, for me as like an AI researcher, it's sometimes it can be sometimes there's a gray area of like what's really specific to this specific animal model versus like what's like a more general motif. So in this case, like you mentioned, even if like in my head, I think of this active pre-training as development. But of course, I'm not a biologist, and like you say, and for zebrafish, much of that even for lots of other animals, even during locomotor maturation, a lot of them mature within hours or days and basically come kind of hard coded. Um, but the that's really just remapping the problem of having this prior to to be from development to having it from evolution. And so even if like the zebrafish don't necessarily like um, uh, let's take motor for example. Motor control is something where these kinds of animals basically become hard coded with knowing how to swim. Like they don't need to know how to swim. Whereas like an elephant, for example, it has to it takes a long time, or a horse takes hours. Humans obviously take years. So zebrafish come hard coded there. So that's not something I would say it's like you need to learn a prior in development. But this is a dynamics prior. So I'm not sure to the extent it's a little bit different, right? It's more cognitive. I'm not sure to the extent that a zebrafish comes with I think it comes with a circuitry for a forward model, but I don't think, it's not necessarily can predict the specifics of environment or signal error in the specific environment without development. But even if that were the case, the fact that these neurons are firing that way and those circuits exist means even if it's not in development, it's encoded in the genome. So then instead of this pre-training stage meaning development, it's just a proxy for the evolutionary process of like developing a circuit that specialized for this prior. And then we say that when we could put the zebrafish in this environment, then it's born. And so this isn't actually part of its life. But the point is, this is just for us a way to build a prior at all without hard coding it. And whether or not it's developmental or it's evolutionary, that's for like it's for Michael Levin maybe to answer.
I guess, yeah, maybe this is why understanding or building agency is so difficult, is because there are all these sorts of really complex priors that are hard coded and you're born with, and we have to just really somehow either recognize them to build them in, or maybe find ways to learn them. Um,
Yeah, so let me mention that for a second. So um yeah, I guess I was going to mention that in closing, but yeah, maybe I only have one more slide, so maybe we can just come back to this discussion. So just to close out, well, one thing to close out is since we're talking about these latent dynamics, it's I just want to emphasize here that even though this, like we've been talking about, this data is kind of easy to predict in a way, like there's lots of different predictions of this data. What matters is sort of the first pass filter of matching behavior. It's kind of interesting to see what the latent dynamics of the other algorithms do. Because you might imagine like maybe they kind of match the circuit given, like I said, the circuit is basically just on and then off and then integrate and then decay. But it's not the case. So for example, the random agent, which is literally a randomly initialized agent, you can see that its vision model basically just encodes the cyclic, it's basically encoding the cyclic colors in the environment. That stripe grading is passing by, it's blue and black. That's what these PCs are essentially encoding the time course of that. But then you look at the trained agents, like, from gamma progress over here, and then you get dynamics that um, completely are completely different computational motifs for this specific zebrafish. Now, what would be the reason why this is interesting is to say that if, for example, gamma progress did capture the behavior really well, it did predict the single cell activity really well. But then when you look at its latent dynamics, if this was the motif, then that kind of predicts a new kind of model, a new type of circuit dynamics that says, oh, maybe it's not as simple as, as the circuit that was proposed. In this case, that gap is pretty close. Yeah, it's a zebrafish, but like for more complex animal models, this is done all the time. Like for example, in the fly visual system, building that sort of model of the fly visual system predicted some certain types of cell types that visual physiologists in Drosophila hadn't been able to identify before. So that's the kind of point that you can kind of do that with embodiment too. We want to make a stronger case with a more interesting animal model, of course, um, but yeah. So, and then the other thing I want to mention that Hadi brought up and picked up on was that um, this really is the first time an agent-based model has predicted neural data in a completely self-supervised way, which, that may or may not be impressive, but the point is just is that it is for me, but if it's not for you, that's totally fine. But the point is just in this literature of trying to like bring neuromechanical models to life, there's been lots of really impressive examples. Like there's this paper from last year where they used DeepMind's virtual rodent to predict striatum data. There's the neuromech fly. You might have heard of this from EPFL, I think. Um, and then this is the DeepMind virtual fly that actually has wings. So this neuromech fly, it's funny, it doesn't actually fly, but this guy does. And it uses the fly visual system that has this specific type of hexagonal CNN. It's kind of cool. The point with all of these, so basically every existing embodied model that has predicted neural data, they've all used supervised learning, and so specifically behavior cloning. So what I mean by that is that because owing to the fact that a rodent body or fly body is so hard to control, what they're doing is basically taking a really fancy imaging data set that's already exists or they designed to image the fly or the rodent and track its locomotion with key points. And they convert those key points to a data set that can be used to supervise the embodiment of the fly and the rodent. And so they train these rodents to just match the kinematics of this data set, and then which is also really cool. And then they show that by doing that, you can predict neural data in various ways. But this is actually the first time like where there's no training data here, and we're able to do that again because the fish is a lot simpler, but it's completely unsupervised, and yet it can still predict the behavior and capture the behavior in the neural data. And so I just wanted to emphasize that.
So I think I want to just add one more thing. I mean, it is impressive, and I think people should recognize that. And we need a lot more work in this area because, and this is my own prior I'm injecting in here, but these behavior cloning, they're very useful. They're fine. Totally great. But in my personal opinion, the only way we're going to achieve understanding of agency and behavior and neural data is through this normative self-supervised approach that is validated on neural data rather than leeching on it to train. So that is, I think, non-negotiable in my opinion, but others might disagree.
No, like I would agree with you. I'd say the one caveat in the defense of behavior cloning is that the even though they're not really, I don't think these guys are interested in sort of the autonomy or self-supervised aspect. For these for example, a fly, like the fly in our mechanical model has like 75 controllable degrees of freedom. And let's say we wanted to do this kind of project in the fly where we like try to see what kind of behaviors emerge with different self-supervised curiosity. It's really hard, like even though the curiosity signal could be good, it's really hard to learn a policy over such a complex embodiment without having a prior. So like one thing, for example, I'm working on now is like it's fine to use behavior cloning to get motor primitives. Like you can get like low level policies for like walking, whatever, for like a rodent like rearing or spinning. There's all kinds of things they do that like it's not going to emerge. It's so high dimensional. It's not going to emerge from like, or probably won't from a self-supervised loss. But once you have these low level motor primitives, it's about the behaviors that you can construct from those, compose from those motor primitives with self-supervised learning to do that. But I agree with your point more generally that like it's never well, at least for me, like it's a must to not train on neural data. Neural data, especially the ways that we record it, is a reduction of the
Mhm.
system into like a very sliver of its intelligence, and also what we're recording is very low dimensional compared to what that animal has evolved to do. And so if you can build a model that is much more general and has, in this case, like an intrinsic drive that it's not specialized for this, but can be by tweaking certain things, like for example, adding that symmetric activation function was a specific tweak for this behavior. Um, then you can test it in the reduced case of like where you have experimental data for, and
Mhm.
that gives you a much more principal normative model for at least how these kinds of the evolutionary constraints that were put on these kinds of systems, and what kinds of objectives, if you like that top-down way of thinking, what kinds of objectives these are optimizing for.
I mean, thanks for the clarification there. I think, yeah, I want to also balance my take with completely agreeing with you that these sorts of descriptive data-driven models are absolutely necessary for discovering facts
Yeah,
and phenomena that later you can hopefully explain with self-supervised approach. So they're actually very complementary, but I
yeah.
wanted to emphasize this normative aspect because I don't think we're doing enough of that. That's my position.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it's just because Yeah, honestly, I think it's just because it's new. It's relatively new, and also the technologies are relatively new as well. So I hope it picks up for sure.
Hmm.
So let me just close out here and say, um, looking ahead, I want to bring back this picture of this sort of spectrum of intrinsic drives and extrinsic drives. So like I started this talk by talking about autonomy, right? Which is kind of a weird word and doesn't might not mean a lot to you. But hopefully when I've been talking about autonomy in this way, it has some sort of concrete meaning. And I think what the next steps are for this is first, so how do you actually kind of mention this? First of like we really should be thinking about what is the space of internal models that animals use, right? We need to identify what the priors are that animals come equipped with, whether it's from development or whether it's from, encoding the genome somehow. It doesn't really matter. We just need to know, like, once you spawn in, basically what's your toolkit, your palette of paint that you're painting with. And for animals, some of these things we know really well, like cognitive maps and motor synergies, right? Motor synergies is an example. This is like really important bias that is like when we say we want an embodiment or like a humanoid or whatever to have intelligent behavior, like you want it to interact with the world in a cool way, it's because actually just the physics of and neurodevelopment of how you actuate your limbs and co-activate certain tendons that gets you really clean and smooth looking movements that you need as a strong prior, or else like you try to learn those things and it's really messy. That's kind of part where the bias of like robotic came from, where you kind of move these joints in your discrete ways. But cognitive maps are also an important thing. And this paper was more about dynamics models, like so sensory motor priors, which I think is kind of been, I don't know, I wouldn't say ignored, but it's just for me, it was like a new concept of things like, oh, how do we computationalize this idea that animals really do have world models that they, whether it's like how you mentioned from development or some other thing, that they have circuits that encode the way things are supposed to go. And once you assume that, there's lots of cool abstractions you can build on top of that to get, models to do interesting things. But without assuming that, then it's like, it's really you're not going to be able to make sense of things. The second thing is like, okay, once we say, okay, the function space we're dealing with are predictive dynamics models, they're motor synergies, maps, what have you, then you want to say what abstractions, self-supervised objectives, can you build on top of that to understand specific autonomous behaviors? So right now, my thing is like we really don't know what what at least the interesting parts of what I think makes animals special, like play, curiosity, really don't know how to generate that. And even though that might have been optimized for evolutionarily to survive or to be a part of a community or to build up motor priors or things like that, um, our agents or models don't have that evolutionary algorithm. So we have to come up and say, how do we computationalize that after the fact and see if they are strong enough models to generate specific autonomous behavior like the intrinsic drive for intellectuality or curiosity or things like that, or exploration. And so these are sort of the dots on this manifold of different drives that motivate behavior. Like you want to be able to pick out, oh, I know this drive is a really good model of exploration. So, and I don't always have to explore, but the point is that is available to me. And this other drive is a really good model for like homeostatic regulation of your food intake. Like those things are easy. The not so easy things are these cognitive drives that really are the glue of interesting intelligent behavior. And then the icing on the cake is like, okay, once you have this space and these examples of different intrinsic drives, that's when you get to autonomy, which is like, how do you specify an algorithm to actually compose these, to sequence these into a composition of an animal-like behavior, right? The behavioral repertoire of animals is enormous, and it's not because, we, it's precisely because we have this like baseline capacity for autonomy, which is this what's generating these arrows here that switches you between drives. And so the grand goal of this would to be if you can specify sort of a compact set of ways extrinsic and intrinsic drives, then you can really start to write down an algorithm that like really generates behavior of a real animal or a real human or whatever. Obviously, these have to be specialized. Um, and so that's sort of the big picture. And that's kind of my last slide. So I know this was yeah, I guess a long one. So thank you for your attention and great questions, everybody. I'm happy to discuss more.
Right, any questions?
I'm just gonna stop so I can see people.
Um, if I can ask a question, I do have one. Thanks for a great talk. We recently, in the series, David Abel presented their paper, Three Dogmas, and one of the sort of books that, or resources that they really recommend, I just started looking through it, so I'm definitely no expert on it myself, is Michael Tomasello's book on the evolution of agency. And he has this very sort of neat evolutionary lineage that he divides the his four different classifications of different stages of agency in. I think the first one is lizards. I guess my first question is like, where does zebrafish fall in that
Yeah.
like phylogeny?
Yeah.
And whether you're familiar with that work, if you can sort of place this in that context.
Unfortunately, I know of that work. I haven't read it myself, but yeah, I would not consider. Yeah, I can't really speak to the evolutionary biological aspect of this. I definitely think the basic idea of having the stages of evolutionary work, like you can see this I mean, all the examples of animals we have right now are basically, and at least in my head as a computer scientist, are basically you cutting off the evolutionary process at different points in time, right? So like if you look at a lizard now versus a human, and it's very clear that that four-stage approach or whatever is probably true, where you have these basic goal-directed circuits, and then and then that's kind of what I'm getting at here is that you have these circuit primitives that are really important, and without understanding what those are, you can't design these more complex goals that build on top of those, like sociality. But I'm not an expert on the evolutionary pathways there. It's more of as after the fact, if we can, it would be cool if we could specify how to evolve those things too. But after the fact, for me, it's like, can we just write down an objective that captures each of those things, now, and rather than replicating the evolutionary process that caused those to develop, because I don't even know if that's tractable. We have examples of babies like if you can computationalize that, then you don't need to, well, at least in my head, you don't need to evolve them. You just have an agent that specifically tracks all of those things and then has some valence function over them, how to choose or switch or whatever. But that's just my naive kind of view of it.
Yeah, I guess my question
I'll
was,
definitely
which
check into
one of
that.
those four do you think you're replicating or modeling the objective up for, if any at all? That's really my main question.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. Yeah, I haven't read the book, so I don't know the nuance of how he defines each one. Like, yeah, so I can't really say. I wouldn't call this goal directed if I just interpret that as it's stated, because I assume that means goal directed in service of like a primary kind of survival reward or like yeah, I don't know, some type of extrinsic state of the world, even if it's not for survival. But so yeah, I haven't read that book, so I don't want to pontificate too much or waste your time. But um
Any more questions, thoughts, final feedback?
Yes, you just mentioned that you wanted kind of understand this relation to empowerment in the beginning, I believe, as one of the goals.
sorry, I didn't quite I had to turn my volume. Could you repeat that?
Right, among all these goals like curiosity-driven behavior and everything, we also like mentioned empowerment. What do you think as a goal? How does it fit in this big picture?
Yeah, so I think I think someone could write a book about this, but I think empowerment is a really interesting objective for if people are still listening and you're not familiar with empowerment. Basically, empowerment is kind of like a measure of an agent's preparedness in an environment. So if you put an agent in an environment, empowerment kind of scores kind of like the reachability of states under that agent's actuation capacity. How can it reliably decode what states it ends up giving an action, and it should pick actions that max like among all possible distributions of things it could do. It should try to be in a state where even if it doesn't do those things, it could do those things. So it's for humans. This would kind of be like if you ask someone if they should own kind of a wine opener if they don't drink, you might say yes, because like maybe I'll need to open that for a friend one day, and it's supposed to quantify that capacity for kind of wanting to be able to occupy a state in your environment that you can controllably reach many other states. So as for how it compares with curiosity, I think it's actually kind of competing in a different way, and they're not things that I think have to be one or the other. So I think it's a really interesting goal, at least the idea that it's trying to capture. The problem with empowerment, though, it hasn't been really empirically verified that well outside of really toy tasks. Um, and so I know people like, for example, I myself am working on that, but other people are too. And the trouble is that empowerment's actually not really a good exploration signal if you think about it, because it wants to put you into a state. It's good for it might be good for understanding the control of your environment, but if you just think about the simplest case where you're in an empty environment and maybe there's one thing you can control, or maybe there's even nothing, it basically wants you to put you into a stable state of just occupying one place where you have maximum control. And while that is a useful signal, the what you want for exploration might be different than that, right? Exploration means you want your policy to converge to something that does something useful, or even if you keep learning, right? Even if you keep training or keep exploring, it should maybe keep recycling or even go to places it's been before. Whereas empowerment, things like that, they converge to a specific policy that would occupy just one state if that optimal state existed. And so that's one thing. Like but it is really useful for learning policies that interact with the environment in an intelligent way because it's control focused. Whereas, curiosity is purely prediction focused. Empowerment has this nice addition of someone else mentioned this too, of caring more actually about being able to make sense of your actions in light of your states. And that's a useful prior to have. So I think that the best kind of models of intrinsic motivation would not be one or the other. These would either be combined or somehow, or something that you're tracking simultaneously, and you can switch between them because they really do motivate very different behaviors, and so they shouldn't be thought of as like one or the other. Um, so yeah, that's what I'll say for now, unless if there's
Here's
one
another
more.
suggestion. So don't use empowerment as a training signal. Use it as some quantity you can um, kind of use to diagnose your
Yeah,
agent.
that's a very good way to put it too. Like that's
Yeah.
also another. Yeah, and I don't want to mean to say it's like not a good learning signal. It's just that um well, it's hard to say what's a good, it was like, what is it good for? Like, curiosity is a good learning signal for exploration. So I wouldn't say empowerment necessarily is good for that, but it is good for maybe learning, for example, um, motor primitives. So, like, there's this line of research called unsupervised skill discovery, where they basically use versions of empowerment to learn policies where you can basically learn options in the environment. Um, what are different low-level policies I can do in this environment that are indexed by some hierarchical variable, and you use empowerment basically to try to find out what are the policies that kind of carve the environment at its joints, kind of like Plato's saying of carving nature at its joints. How do you do the most controllable things in the environment? So it's really useful for that, but wanting to control the environment necessarily isn't necessarily on the same axis as exploration. It can be. It just depends on, yeah. And so I think that's a good,
Actually,
and
no,
that's
okay. No, let me give you
yeah.
something even more specific. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Dave Abel here present his work, Empowerment and Plasticity are a mirror of each other. The idea is that they introduced this information theoretic measure,
I'm
generalized.
familiar. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So they
yeah.
have
Just
this
so
like
you don't have to.
right? So you have
Yeah,
all these agents, and only one of them is more zebrafish-like, and maybe you can just with a histogram method or something estimate the plasticity and the empowerment, and then situate those different agents on the simplex and see if your agent has some interesting, like it occupies an interesting point where the others fail to capture. I don't know, something like that would be an interesting curiosity.
Yeah, yeah. And this specific behavior actually is quite related to empowerment because
Yeah.
if you think about the zebrafish behavior, the zebrafish is literally trying to avoid taking actions that don't control the environment, which is kind of what empowerment is supposed to measure. And
Mhm.
so I do think it's really interesting to use it more of a diagnostic tool because you can also not even for agents, like you can use it as diagnose the environment, like
Mm.
how much does this environment afford control versus how much does the like based on my agent's actuators can I exert control on the environment. Um, so it's yeah, that would be interesting to look at.
All right. Very cool. All right. Thanks again, Reece, for the great talk. It was really, really exciting and gave me a lot to think about. And next week, we're going to have Reece's academic grandfather, Dan Yammons, to
Oh yeah,
continue talking about world modeling. So see you guys next week.
yeah, and just
Great.
yeah, if anyone also wants to chat more or has questions, feel free to email me. You can just Google it. But thank you for your attention.
All right. Thanks, Reece. See ya.
Yeah, see you, Adi.